So I'd like you to imagine for a moment what it must be like to be trapped inside a building that is being bombed, or what it might be like to be trapped inside a firefight with bullets whizzing all around you. And I want you to imagine for a moment what these weapons could do to your body, the terrible pain and suffering they would cause you, the damage that they would do to flesh and bone, the fact that these weapons are so destructive that they might leave you unrecognisable as a human being. Because we often talk about war and the weapons that we use to fight these wars, but we rarely discuss the wounds they cause. And I think this is a problem, because we have invented some pretty horrendous weapons that are not only capable of extinguishing human lives, but literally obliterating the body. Now, when we see all of this death and destruction around us, it can be difficult for us to accept that war should be limited, that there are supposed to be limits, external restraints, restricting how much violence can be unleashed. But there are rules, and these rules are known as international humanitarian law, or the laws of armed conflict. So there's rules about who is allowed to fight in these conflicts. There are rules about who can be targeted. And there are even rules about what weapons can be used. And in this talk, I want to focus on the specific rules about the weapons that can be used. And in particular, I want to talk about the principle of unnecessary suffering and superfluous injury. Now, this principle might sound quite technical, but its aims are relatively straightforward. The principle of unnecessary suffering and superfluous injury is supposed to make war less cruel and more humane, by banning certain weapons on the grounds that they cause too much harm, more than's necessary to achieve their objectives. And what's interesting about these rules is they seem to accept that some pain and suffering is acceptable, that it's okay for these weapons to cause some harm to their victims. But they suggest there should be some outer limits on how much pain and suffering is needed. Now, it's difficult to overstate how important this principle is. It's seen as a cornerstone of international humanitarian law, and it's been used to ban or regulate all sorts of weapons, including landmines, poisonous gases, and blinding lasers. And the principle's also been invoked in recent discussions about banning explosive weapons in populated areas, and it's been a persistent feature of debates about nuclear weapons. But what really interests me is how international humanitarian law decides how much pain is too much. I'm interested in how it decides what suffering is necessary and what suffering is unnecessary, what wounds are essential and what wounds should be considered superfluous. I want to know how the law can point at some injuries and claim that that's perfectly acceptable, whilst pointing at other injuries and saying that it's unacceptable. How does international law draw that line? Now, the answer, as we'll see in a moment, is not that obvious. The International Committee of the Red Cross, that sees itself as a kind of guardian of international humanitarian law, has always struggled with this question. It has convened several workshops and conferences looking for answers, and it's assembled an assortment of experts to help find a solution, including medical professionals, legal specialists, and even military personnel. My talk today was actually inspired by one of the experts who spoke in one of these events. In 1989, Professor Warren was asked to present a paper on blinding lasers, focusing particular attention on the psychological effects of sudden and total permanent blindness in adults. But before he delivered his paper, he turned to the committee and said, and I'm quoting here, "For the sake of my conscience, I cannot readily accept the framework of this meeting. I understand it, and I understand the need to work within it for the next few days. But anyone who might hear or read my words on the potential effects of laser-induced battlefield blindness should also know that I find it astounding that we are gathered here talking about whether it should be judged impermissible to blind someone with a laser, whereas it's totally permissible to burn him with napalm or dismember him with bombs and bullets. We are truly faced with a situation," he argued, "in which our capability to create technological havoc is far better developed than our ability to deal with its legal and moral consequences." End quote. Now, I share his concerns. like Professor Warren, I understand why people might look at the damage caused by certain weapons and think that these wounds are particularly horrendous. But I don't understand how they can look at the damage caused by other weapons and think that this is okay, that it's morally and legally acceptable to cause this harm to other human beings. Professor Antonio Cassisi also struggled with the principle, albeit for slightly different reasons. He argued that the principle is, and I'm quoting again, couched in such vague and uncertain terms that it's barren of practical effects. So he was worried that the distinction between necessary and unnecessary suffering was so fuzzy that international lawyers couldn't provide a good reason as to why some injuries were acceptable and others were unacceptable. And for Professor Cassisi, this wasn't just a moral concern, it was a practical problem, something that could actually impede efforts to ban or regulate certain weapons. If the international community could not agree on what qualifies as unnecessary suffering, then how could the international community agree about what specific weapons ought to be regulated? So we have a problem that I think is really fascinating. There is a principle that is central to international humanitarian law, a principle that's been used on numerous occasions to ban various weapons, but one that's considered so vague that it's almost completely useless. So what should be done? In my own work, I argue that we need to turn to history, that we need to delve into the archives to understand how this principle emerged, when it's been applied, and the specific meanings that have been ascribed to the terms unnecessary suffering and superfluous injury. We need to look at how different people, at different times and in different places, have sought to differentiate between acceptable and unacceptable injuries, between what is necessary and unnecessary on the battlefield. And I think we can learn a lot from failed attempts to articulate alternative ways of defining what is necessary and unnecessary. So I'm not suggesting here that history can provide us with an answer to these problems, a better definition that kind of removes all of this ambiguity and uncertainty. Instead, I'm suggesting we re-examine how the term has been used to look at the contestation around it, so we can start to find alternative definitions that didn't necessarily make their way into international law, but might help us understand the harms inflicted in the present. And this probably reveals a little bit about my normative agenda. I'm a pacifist, I'm opposed to all weapons and all wars. But what I like about the principle of unnecessary suffering is that it forces us to think about the harm inflicted upon the human body. There's no escaping it, there's no turning away. And I'm optimistic that the term can be reappropriated, perhaps misappropriated, to highlight the destructiveness of contemporary conflict. So let's do some digging. The origins of the term can be traced back to the St. Petersburg Declaration of 1868, which banned the use of explosive projectiles weighing less than 400 grams. This is quite a specific ban. The context was that the Russian army had been experimenting with an exploding bullet that could be used to destroy the wooden ammunition chests used by the enemy. But the bullet could be easily modified to explode on contact with soft tissue. Fearing that these bullets would be used against his own soldiers, Tsar Alexander II convened a meeting in St. Petersburg to discuss a ban. Other European powers came, but they were initially reluctant to agree to a ban, fearing that they would have to abandon their existing technological advantages or forego some future development. But they eventually agreed, and I'm quoting again here, that the technical limits of war, there should be some technical limits at which the necessities of war ought to yield to the requirements of humanity. They agreed that it was okay for militaries to try and weaken the enemy, but they had an obligation to alleviate as much as possible what they described as the calamities of war. And crucially, they banned these bullets on the grounds that they uselessly aggravate the suffering of disabled men or render their deaths inevitable. In other words, they were concerned that these bullets caused more damage than was necessary to achieve their aims. Although the delegates at this conference invoked the language of humanitarianism, historians like my colleague Marcia Abbenhuis have argued that self-interest was probably a bigger factor. Militaries weren't really concerned about the damage that was going to be done to soldiers' bodies. They were concerned that soldiers wouldn't agree to fight in these wars if they knew what could happen to them. So rather than simply trying to limit the destructiveness of war, these rules helped to rehabilitate war. They helped to ensure that it was still possible for political leaders to take soldiers to the battlefield. And it's worth noting that these limits only applied to signatories to the Declaration. There were limits to the limits. The bullets could still be used in conflicts outside of Europe. And several signatories argued that they needed the bullets, they needed these exploding bullets in the colonies, invoking profoundly racist ideas about needing a more cruel and inhumane weapon to subdue non-Western peoples. Since then, the principle has been invoked in relation to several other weapons, although it's still not always clear what it means or how it should be applied. In 1973, the International Committee of the Red Cross tried to resolve these problems by convening another panel of experts. The panel agreed that what suffering must be deemed unnecessary or what injury might be deemed superfluous is not really that easy to define. But there were some really fascinating discussions about how these definitional deficiencies could be overcome. There was one group of people, for example, who suggested that you could devise some sort of scientific metric to measure in objective terms how much pain people were experiencing, and that metric could be used to determine the precise point at which too much pain was being inflicted, the precise moment that injury became superfluous. In their view, the conceptual problems could be resolved with a technical fix. They could quantify pain objectively and determine how much is too much. But this idea was rejected because others argued that our experience of pain is too subjective, that there's no universally valid points which could be used to distinguish what is acceptable and unacceptable. Another group of experts at the conference argued that the principle should be interpreted in much narrower terms, that the problem was not so much the weapons themselves, but unnecessary modifications to these weapons. So the problem with exploding bullets, they argued, was the fact that the same results could be achieved with more conventional ammunition. It was the fact that they'd been changed to explode on contact with soft tissue that was the issue. And they pointed to various other weapons that had been banned for similar reasons. Lances that had been wrapped in barbed wire, bayonets with serrated edges, and bullets dipped in poisonous chemicals. So these weapons, they argued, should be prohibited because the modifications caused additional pain and suffering beyond what was already what was already needed to kill or injure the victim. There's a third group of experts who argued that we need a much more expansive definition, which acknowledges that all wars and all weapons cause unnecessary pain to the victims. Like Professor Warren, these experts were concerned that existing weapons were already causing horrific injuries, and that these weapons shouldn't be ignored simply because they were already in widespread use. And this conference took place in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, and there was a lot of discussion about the defoliants used to strip leaves from trees so that American soldiers could spot guerrillas hiding in the jungle. We now know that these chemicals cause enormous ecological damage, that rainforests have struggled to regenerate. We know that they cause long-term health effects to the victims, with the Vietnamese Red Cross estimating that as many as 1 million people have suffered illness as a consequence. And we know that these weapons have caused intergenerational harm, with children born with various birth defects as a consequence. They argued that if we really cared about eliminating unnecessary suffering, we would ban many more weapons. So delving into the historical archives cannot resolve our definitional dilemmas or help us escape our conceptual problems. There's no dusty document waiting to be uncovered that will provide us with a more coherent or comprehensive definition that will remove all of the uncertainty and ambiguity that haunts the principles of unnecessary suffering and superfluous injury. The archives won't provide us, they cannot provide us with any firmer foundations, but they reveal that definitions like superfluous injury and unnecessary suffering have always been contested, they've always been unstable, and insecure. And there's always been other ways of thinking through the harms inflicted on the battlefield. So examining the genealogy of these concepts enables us to look at the different meanings that have been ascribed to these concepts at different moments in history, as well as the alternative definitions that have long been forgotten. And perhaps looking at these contested meanings will help liberate us from the conceptual straitjacket, revealing how we might go about rethinking, reimagining, and reinterpreting the concept to oppose the pain and suffering inflicted on the battlefield. And it's my hope that the principle can be repurposed to oppose not just specific weapons and specific wounds, but oppose war itself, to draw attention to the unnecessary suffering and superfluous injury that all weapons and all wars are responsible for causing.